Welcome to the Life Stuff 101 podcast, dedicated to sharing stories and insights to inspire you to always make your mental and emotional wellness a top priority. We talk to people who share their personal journeys and experiences, as well as to people who share their professional expertise. And there'll also be other times when we share personal tips and stories, which will hopefully somehow spark that aha moment for you too. Because we all have those moments when we think, I wish I had known that earlier in life. That's what Life Stuff 101 is all about. Our discussion today is for general information purposes and not meant to be specific advice. For personalized support and specific answers to questions you may have, please consult the appropriate medical or mental health care professional. Now here's your host who's on this wild adventure ride of life just like you, and yes, a real life person who's actually slipped on a banana peel along the way. Mental wellness coach and psychotherapist Yokoi.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Life Stuff 101. My name is Yokoi, and it's my goal to inspire you to make your mental and emotional health and wellness one of your top priorities. Because as you'll hear in today's episode, mental health is a thing. And I really wanted to feature my guest today, Omar Bazza, in this week's episode because it's being released ahead of Bell's Let's Talk Day. Let's Talk Day is a mental health awareness initiative sponsored by Bell Canada, which was initially created to address mental health stigma in Canada. But since its inception in 2011, it's become a more far-reaching campaign. Bell pledges to donate 5 cents for every share of Bell Let's Talk hashtag on social media on Wednesday, January 29th for this year, 2020. So the hashtag is Bell Let's Talk. Hashtag Bell Let's Talk. And it is an annual campaign at this point. And this year, when this episode is being released, is 2020. And it's on Wednesday, January 29th. I also realize that there are many people outside of Canada who listen to this podcast, but I wanted to mention it because I realize that it's more than a Canadian conversation that occurs on Let's Talk Day because of the global nature of social media. But because the real importance is not in the day itself, but the larger need for us to keep having conversations and actions about mental health awareness. I personally make a distinction between mental health and mental illness in that I believe that mental health is all-encompassing. It's something that every single one of us as human beings need to care for because we all possess mental health, just as we care for and possess our physical health. And just as we treat and manage physical illness, it is my hope that we think about mental illness in similar ways as we think about physical illness. And I feel that this distinction is being made more in public discussions, and specifically with the ways in which the Let's Talk campaign is addressing it this year too. While there's still the very important emphasis on the need to better understand and treat mental illness and to remove stigma, there's also an inclusion in the messaging of the Let's Talk campaign about our thoughts and feelings. And whether it's parents talking to their kids or friends and colleagues, family members, loved ones, talking about their thoughts and feelings over lunch or coffee, I think that this is also a really important inclusion of the Bell Let's Talk or even the Let's Talk around the conversation and discussions around mental health. But let me get back to my guest today, Omar Bazza, who is someone who embodies and lives the spirit of the Let's Talk campaign in his day job as a therapist and as an incredible mental health resource on Twitter to anyone who has questions or looking for help and support. And as a side note, my conversation with Omar was recorded late in 2019, so you'll hear us mention this year a few times, which is actually referencing 2019. To learn more about Omar and the support and education he provides on Twitter, as well as to be witness to some serious relationship goals, his Twitter handle is @BazzaPower. That's @BAZZAPOWER. That's Z in Canada here, but also @BAZZAPOWER. He is passionate, thoughtful, and deeply cares about people, which is why I'm so pleased to bring you our discussion today. I hope you enjoy my conversation with Omar Bazza. So, hi Omar, thanks for joining me today.
Thank you.
So, part of my discovery process in working on this podcast is doing this new thing for me, and it's called social media. Not really new to many people, but it is for me. Actually, when I first started working in private practice about 10 years ago, I decided to opt out of social media for a bunch of reasons. But I think the really big one for me was that I couldn't really get my head around having a public persona and also being a therapist. I do believe, though, that a lot's changed in the last 10 years because 10 years ago, social media was still like a relatively new thing. But I came across your account when I was doing research about how people were using Twitter to talk about mental health. And what I think you're doing online is really amazing work. And I was so thrilled to see that you're in Toronto, just like I am. And I've been following you ever since. So thank you again so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. But before we jump into our chat today, I'd like to ask each of my guests to share a fun fact. And I'm curious to know what's a fun fact you can share with us today, Omar.
A fun fact, I grew up in 13 countries. So my dad is a diplomat in the UN. And growing up, we had to move every few years. So I got to see quite a few countries growing up.
13 countries.
Yes.
Wow. Is it okay if I ask which 13 countries?
Yeah, so Morocco is my home country, Spain, France, South Africa. I lived in Syria, Yemen, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, United States, UK, Canada. I'm sure I'm forgetting some.
I think that was 11.
Okay. Oh, Sweden for 6 months and Italy.
Well, that's amazing. And in a lot of continents as well.
Yes.
I wonder if it is okay for me to ask you a follow-up question. So Morocco being your home country, how come Canada now?
I transferred to Vancouver actually when I was in undergrad. I lost my scholarship for playing soccer in the NCAA and decided to move to Canada because university was cheaper. And I never looked back. I just stayed here.
So on top of having lived in 13 countries, you were also playing soccer and had a scholarship with the NCAA.
Yes.
Where did you find? My mind is completely blown. I mean, I'm thinking as you're moving around to all these countries and you're playing soccer at this high level, that's pretty amazing.
Yeah, well, my father is very athletic and he was my coach in so many sports growing up. So, yeah, so I always played sports.
Yeah, so he was a diplomat, but also had time to be this.
Yeah, also my coach, when he was not traveling around, he was coaching me.
Oh, wow. Thank you so much for that. That's amazing.
Thank you.
So your Twitter profile says that you're a therapist by day and nerd by night. And, well, I honestly like to know more about both those things. Can you please tell us more about your day job as a clinical therapist?
Yeah, so I was hired under a provincial funding to work with newcomer refugees from Syria and Iraq because I speak Arabic and I'm trained in trauma. So a lot of these newcomers have a lot of trauma coming from situations where there is war and they've lost family members, they've had to be displaced. And so that's how I started my career here in Toronto.
Can you talk more about your trauma training?
Yeah, so I studied a lot of trauma during my master's degree, but I also chose a placement working with a church in the UK where they were working with newcomer refugees. And so that's where I learned a lot of what I know about trauma therapy that I'm actually using up to this day.
Right. So you mentioned that you transferred to Canada and Vancouver when you were doing your bachelor's. And I know that you sent me your bio, and I think you mentioned that you had done your master's of science in the UK.
Yes.
And that's where your training was.
Yes.
And then came back to Canada.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm really cognizant of the fact that since starting this podcast, which was only like a few months ago, the helping professionals I've spoken to so far have all been in private practice. So I'm curious to know more about the therapy work in a publicly funded organization. And I understand that you work with youth. Would that be right?
Yes, correct. It's mostly youth, but I also work with their families and so on. So it ends up being all ages pretty much.
Okay. Can you tell me more about how your clients access the services that are provided?
Yeah, so there are multiple ways to do it. We have a walk-in clinic, which is free for anyone, doesn't require a health card or even an ID. And usually, you have some youth that access the walk-in clinic and then end up being referred to me. I also have some connections with TDSB, so that would be the school board,
Mm-hmm.
who refer some youth to me. Same with physicians. The referral sources come from a little everywhere, and that's how I get most of my clients.
And they do come through the organization that you work for, which is the East York
East Metro Youth Services.
Metro Youth Services. Because I think the one thing that is confusing, particularly where we are in Ontario, Canada, provincially, in terms of mental health services, it's tough to know what is publicly available.
Yeah, that's correct. It's a system that is sometimes very complicated to navigate, and especially for youth who may not know exactly where to go or how to access these services. I know that the agency where I work at, has been trying to facilitate those barriers, but I recognize that there are still some out there.
Right. But so mostly the ways in which people find you are through physicians or TDSB, I think, which is the Toronto District School Board.
Yes.
And for those people who know that there is actually accessibility through your walk-in clinic.
Yes, that's correct.
I wonder, the folks that do walk into the clinic, do you have a sense of where they find out about your services?
So when I started my career, I did a lot of outreach. And during my outreach, I would go to different schools, different community centers, things like that. And I would leave my business card where they would have my email, phone number. And whenever they came across a case that would fit the profile with the profile of clients that I work with, they would give me a call or send me an email. And that's how most of the referrals started. Then after that, it was mostly word of mouth, where youth who have worked with me or families who have worked with me will let another family know. And then I would get a phone call regarding that. And it kind of snowballed from there.
That's really great. I wonder what it was, if you could help me, like maybe go through the process of when you were first hired, that rather than just for having the agency or the organization provide you with clients, that you actually did your own outreach. Can you maybe give me an understanding of like what your thinking was around that?
I was a little stressed at the beginning about it because I came to a new city. I was living in Vancouver. When I was hired, I actually did my interviews through Skype. So I moved in right before work, and I still had to get used to the neighborhood and my colleagues and all that. It was a little stressful, but actually not too bad. Everyone was very welcoming. Whenever I went to a school or anything like that, it was very easy. So it wasn't as stressful as I made it out to be in my mind.
I think anything, especially when we're sort of anticipating a new thing. But that is, I mean, even after moving or living in 13 different places or different countries, I'd imagine that coming to a new city and then also starting a new position where maybe you didn't necessarily know what to expect. But was that part of the expectation that they had when they hired you, is that you do some of that community outreach?
Yes, so because I'm a clinical therapist in the youth outreach worker department, and
I see.
youth outreach workers, part of it is to outreach. And so that
Right.
was still part, and it's still up to this day part of my duties. Not a big part, but I still do some outreach every now and then.
Right. And actually, that sort of leads me into the question that I have. And again, having been on the private practice side of things, I have a sense of, I think, what a day looks like for a private practice clinician. But I'm curious if you can describe what a typical day or maybe a few days of your work might look like.
Yeah, for the most part, I start work at 9 a.m. usually between 9 and noon, and I usually have a few hours for database updates. So whenever I have any interaction, I need to update that in our database. Then I have a few sessions. It really depends which day. Some days I have 4 sessions, some days I only have 2 sessions. And other than that, I also have some youth engagement. So we have some programs like Drop In, East Crew, many programs where youth come to our agency. So I do a lot of youth engagement there also. So that's typically what a day looks like at my job.
Can you give me a little bit more detail around what youth engagement, what that looks like?
Yeah, so we have an area called the Zone, where we have a pool table, ping pong table, where we have a kitchen and there is food, video games. And so it's an area for you to come in and be able to play, socialize with other youth and have staff there that they can talk to if they have any issues. And there are always at least 2 staff members on shift who are working on drop-in. And we also do that in partnership with the City of Toronto. So there are also City of Toronto staff usually at those programs, and they also have their own programs. So we use that zone to engage with youth and, make sure that they're okay.
Okay, and that drop-in is something that's available on a daily basis?
So drop-in is usually Monday, Wednesday, Friday from 3 to 5 p.m. After 5 p.m., there is usually city program up till 8 or 9 p.m. But we also have some other programs. We have a multimedia program with a recording studio in case you'd want to record a song, if they want to take some pictures and edit them. We have a multimedia person who is there to help them. We have other programs such as New Mentality, where youth come to discuss mental health. We have a youth advisory council where youth come in and decide what we do with the zone, any improvements that we can do. So there are a lot of those programs that take time.
That's really great. I'm curious to know, so in terms of numbers, how many people would you say are taking advantage of the programs that you and your agency offer?
It really depends. We have some highs and lows. So I remember last year was insane. We had about 60 youth come in every single drop-in,
Wow.
which is a lot.
Yeah.
Right now, I would say we have between 10 and 20. It's always a bit less during winters because it's really cold out. So people don't really move a lot. But yeah, we still have quite a few people who attend the program.
And just from your experience, do you have a sense of why at that time last year there were so many more youth that were taking advantage of the program?
I'm not really sure because I'm not working directly in that department. So I don't know how it happened that the number was so high, but I'm guessing it's mainly youth who come in, then want to bring their friends, etc. And then it just becomes where we have a lot of youth because most of them know each other.
Right. Well, it's great to get an understanding of what is available publicly for youth, and what is the age group when you say youth?
Yeah, so when I started, it was 12 to 29. So that's for myself specifically, for the youth I work with. But we started seeing some of these issues in younger youth. So right now I'm also working with youth who are younger than 12. So I would say 8 to 29.
And in terms of the therapeutic work that you do with your clients, would you say that it's more short term, or is it, or does it depend on the client that you're working with?
So my program was designed to be more short term in theory, but in practice, I actually have some clients that I've been working with for a very long time. Some that I've been working with since the start of my career at East Metro Youth Services.
And also, you mentioned that there are times when you work with families as well. I wonder what it is where you're able to identify that it could be helpful to have the family come in and engage in the work as well.
Yeah, it's really important, especially for youth who are still living with their families. I feel that no matter what, for most problems that they have, it's something that can be solved within the family because they're still our primary, the people that we spend the most time with. And a lot of these issues either originate there or escalate within the family. So it's always good to have the family involved in the treatment of youth. And it allows them to also help them better when they're at home. Because at the end of the day, they only spend 1 hour a week with me and the rest of the time is at home. So when there are these issues continue at home, it kind of undermines the process of therapy also.
Well, again, thank you very much for getting into some of the details around the agency that you work with and your work, because it's very difficult, at least I'll speak personally for myself, to just get an understanding of what public services are available from a mental health support perspective. And I know that perhaps, I actually don't know, I'm assuming here that maybe there seems to be more programs for youth. Outside of that, it feels like it's mostly with through CAMH and maybe psychiatrists, which requires referrals from primary care physicians and so forth. It's really great to know that there are these programs that are available publicly.
Yeah, for sure. And we also have actually a telepsychiatry where we can refer you to psychiatrists. And they don't even have to go to the psychiatrist's office. They can just do a Skype session with the psychiatrist. So we try to tie in those loose ends a little, where we have connections with many services, so we can do a multidisciplinary form of treatment for our clients.
That's really fantastic. It's if they're able to take, by they, I guess, in terms of like public programs, if more of the kind of model that you're just talking about now could be expanded, that I think it would be so great. And it's unfortunate that there isn't more of those kinds of programs that are just universally available.
Yeah, absolutely. And I strongly believe that mental health is, it falls under the same umbrella as other health issues and should be very public, and free for treatment.
Yes, I completely agree as well. And I think sort of shifting over to this idea of maybe talking more about mental health, and having more accessibility to mental health. As I'd mentioned earlier, I'm personally just in the process of lending my voice more publicly when it comes to contributing to discussions about mental health. And I think it's so great that you engage so directly on Twitter to have these conversations and to answer questions with folks online, and also to do it using Twitter's character limits. I think that's one of the things.
Yeah, that's a big.
I'm so like I've been looking through your tweets and I'm like, oh my goodness, like you inspire me to learn to be more concise and to be more articulate in that way, because like the way that you're able to answer people's questions just as one reply is very impressive.
Well, it takes some time and it takes some editing, because most of the time when I answer those questions, I'm way above it. And then I try to see which words to delete, which sentences may not be as informative. And that's how I usually stay within the word limit.
Yeah. And so I realize that as we're talking about it, I understand the ways in which you engage on Twitter. And we'll get into, I think, maybe more of the details so that the people who are listening could maybe have a better understanding of what you do. But before we actually get into that, I'm curious to know what your process has been to make the decision to address mental health questions and concerns as publicly as you do on social media.
Yeah, so I'm not really. So the way it started is that my partner influenced me to be more active on social media, because up until last year, I did not have an Instagram account. I did not have a Twitter account. So I've always wanted to have a platform where I can talk publicly about mental health and freely without any restrictions. So when I created my Twitter account, I realized that this was the best platform to address that. And that's when I slowly started engaging in those conversations.
I would say not so slowly, because I only realized as I was just going through, just preparing for our chat today, that you opened your account in January of this year.
Yes, correct.
2019.
Yes.
Yeah. And so was it from the very beginning that you decided to, so you talked about your partner encouraging you to engage, but so it was an intentional thing on your part to decide to engage in this way, engage publicly about mental health in this way, and that's the reason why you opened and started your Twitter account?
Yeah, that's correct. I've always wanted to have a platform to do that. I was always shy about pulling the trigger and actually doing it, because I thought that I may not have many things worth talking about or that people would like to have as information. So I always kind of thought about it or daydreamed about it without actually doing it. So when I started my Twitter account, I just decided to give it a go and see where it goes.
Would you say that it was that encouragement that you got, or what was it about the January of this year that you decided, okay, this is when I'm going to start doing it? Because like you just mentioned, you've been thinking about it, of doing that for a while. I'm just part of what I'm always curious about is what it is that influences or inspires people to just take that risk or that step. And I'm curious from your experience, like what it was in January where you said, okay, this is I'm going to throw my hat in the ring.
Oh, yeah, I remember it was just a conversation that I had with my partner, and she told me, okay, Omar, you need to actually do your create your account. And I told her, okay, if you can create my account, I'll start using it. Because I've never been on Twitter before or anything. So I let her create my profile. She just asked me what I wanted my handle to be, things like that. And then she created my account, and it just started from there.
Was she also the one that said that you're a nerd by night?
No, that was all me.
That was all you? Okay. And I do want to ask you more about that. I don't know that we have time today, but it is something that did pop out for me. So I actually do have some curiosity around. I wonder what it is, and if you know why it is that your partner was so encouraging or has been so encouraging of you engaging on social media.
Yeah, she just thought that I had things to say that would interest other people, that could be helpful to other people, and I always wanted to have a platform where I could express those thoughts and provide help to on a larger scale. Because you are a therapist, so you know that the work we do is very individual, and it takes time just for one individual to recover. And I wanted mental health to be accessible to more people, and I guess that's where the whole idea came from.
And it's so fascinating to me when you said just a few moments ago that you weren't sure what it is that you can contribute or if you had enough to say. I think I'm paraphrasing there, but the way in which you talk about mental health on your Twitter account, I think is so amazing that you have so much to say and so much valuable things to say. So I'm really glad that you had that encouragement, and certainly your partner is right on
Thank you.
about her encouragement of you to do that. So I mean, congratulations to the both of you, really, I feel.
Thank you. I'll let her know when she comes back from work.
So as we were talking about what you do actually on Twitter, just so that people listening can have a better sense of what it is, this is what I've mainly observed, and you can maybe let me know if you think about it more or if there's like different additional ways and things that maybe that you do think about in terms of what you share on Twitter. So I've mainly observed that you do three things. One is that you educate and give context and descriptions to topics and concerns when it comes to mental health. Secondly, you hold regular AMAs or Ask Me Anythings or Q&As to answer specific questions that folks may have. And I think what you do, is it on a weekly basis, generally speaking?
Yes, it's every weekend.
Every weekend. And so you make yourself available to answer questions, and you tweet that out, and then people reply to that, and then you answer questions. And that's when I was saying, wow, it's really amazing that you're able to answer and get those replies in within the Twitter character limit.
Yeah.
And I think the third thing that you also do is you make yourself available via DM for folks to reach out to you if they're in need.
Yes.
Would you say that's mainly the ways in terms of the mental health?
Yeah, that's a perfect summary, actually.
Yeah. So if you can describe maybe how you approach these three areas or these three ways of talking about mental health. Again, like, was it something that you had intentionally decided that these were the three ways in which you were going to discuss mental health on Twitter?
No, I never really structured it. I just went with, and that was the idea of having that Twitter account, is that I'm free to approach mental health in a way that I love, in a way that that is not very structured, or where I can be flexible and change the structure depending on whether something works or not. And I found that the three areas that you discussed, the three main things that I do, have been the most helpful, or at least the feedback that I got were what people loved the most. I remember when I started my Twitter account early this year was when I had that pinned tweet that said that people could reach me through DMs. That's really the most popular of where I have the most communication. So a lot of people send me those really long DMs where they give me the history of what they're going through and what they're going through right now, the symptoms that they have, and how can they fight that or how can they recover from that. So that's where I have the longest of conversations with people.
Well, I wonder if you wouldn't mind maybe talking more about that. So when you do have, I think it's a pinned tweet on your account that invites people to DM you if they have any questions or if they're in need. And you mentioned it is the most engagement, it sounds like, that you get.
Yes, absolutely.
Can you talk about, I mean, not necessarily like specifics about the kinds of things that people reach out to you about, but is that something that you hear from people? Would you say on a daily basis, multiple times daily?
Yeah, it's usually on a daily basis. The most messages I get happen after I tweet, usually, or during my AMAs. So certain people don't want their information to be public on a tweet, so they send me their questions in a DM form instead. So those are usually when I get the most messages.
And do you address those queries that you get in sort of the same format as your AMAs? Or do you find that maybe there's more engagement?
Yeah, there is definitely more engagement. My responses are very long and very detailed, and I give them sometimes I can attach some resources, some worksheets, things like that. So it's very, because there is no character limit, or it's not a way for me to summarize, I can be very detailed in my DM.
And can you talk then more about also the AMAs that you do? How did that come about?
I really don't remember how I started it. Yeah, I think it was just a way to. Oh yeah, because sometimes people would reach out to me with just very short questions and very general questions that didn't have to do with what they were going through or their own mental health. And that's when I decided that maybe those AMAs can be a format for those questions to be expressed, where they weren't very confidential, they were very general, and maybe other people that read the AMAs could also benefit from the answers and those questions.
I think the really powerful thing about social media is that there is the accessibility. And I think I think sometimes the barriers around mental health is, and getting mental health support and help is accessibility. Also, it could be challenging when folks can't necessarily relate to maybe people who are mental health professionals. I'm curious to know, for you, have you found that there has been certain populations that maybe it's age, or maybe it's other kinds of demographic information, but have you found that there are certain populations that tend to engage with you or ask questions or reach out to you, or do you find that it's actually been like all kinds of people?
Yeah, it's generally all kinds of people if we're talking about social media. But there are also certain cultures where mental health is not as discussed or as important. Even for me back home in Morocco and in Arab countries, generally speaking, mental health is not really a thing. Even when I meet youth here who are from Arabic speaking countries, they have a hard time understanding what mental health is, what therapists do, and things like that. So it takes a lot of explaining and sometimes convincing that mental health is really important. So there are those cultural differences, and we need to be mindful of them when we navigate those systems. But other than that, I found that after a while, everyone is open about it.
So, and I guess maybe to some degree that takes us to the psychoeducation piece. I guess that's sort of the jargon
Yeah.
that we use around educating mental health. I'm curious to know, because I see that, so when you do the educational pieces, it's very articulate and it's very well thought out. Is it that you plan those out, or is it for you, like at times you just have you're inspired to talk about certain topics or concerns?
Yeah, on social media, it's just inspiration. My mind is always working all the time. I'm thinking about mental health, and well, not all the time because that would be insane, but most of the time,
You have to sleep sometime
yeah.
too, right?
When my mind is just, I'm doing something, and in the background, I'm just thinking about something else. That's usually when my mind comes up with those threads to discuss. But then in my work, also my day job, I also do presentations, whether it's at schools, community centers, things like that. But those are well planned out and very structured.
And just as you mentioned that, would you say that there have been things in your professional work which may have influenced you to provide support and education online?
Yeah, I think it's more from my personal life than from my work. Because in my work, everyone can access those services. So it's really, barriers are very reduced. But I've also noticed when I go back home to visit my family or just interacting with people who don't have the chance to access those services and how much they can suffer, that's what really pushed me to do that more so than my professional work.
I'm wondering if there are some common questions or concerns that you're asked about more often online.
Yeah, I feel like it kind of mirrors the outside world or statistics about mental health, where it's mainly depression, anxiety, and there is trauma there also. So those would be the top three issues or questions that I get the most when it comes to social media.
So when you and specifically around like maybe mood disorders like anxiety and depression, are are the questions mostly the same, or is it that people are wondering if it is that they're struggling with anxiety or depression? Like, is it that people are trying to understand if they are or not, or is it? I'm sure it's a number of things, but is there a lot of questions about that people aren't sure what it is that they may be experiencing?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a huge part of it where, okay, so I'm going through this and this. Can I call it depression? Can I call it anxiety? Is that what it is? So a lot of it is looking for those answers and putting a label on it so that they know what it is and can start recovering from it. Because a lot of it is, I feel like a lot of the fear that people who reach out to me have is that it's the unknown. They don't exactly know what they're going through and they want to put a name on it so that they can start recovering.
Right. And is it an interesting, almost like a paradox to some degree, because diagnosis can sometimes also come with a stigma, but also it can help people understand that it's a thing, right? Not just some random experience that particular individual is having. So having a label on it could maybe provide a sense of an understanding for someone that they are experiencing something that is part of the human condition. But at the same time, it could be challenging if a certain diagnosis or a label can also be, to some degree, like stigmatizing in terms of, oh, like maybe this makes me weak in some way or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. And labels can also follow us for the rest of our life. If in a medical file it's written depression or anxiety, borderline, any of those mental health issues, they can really follow us and they become part of us, even if it's something that's just temporary. So there are some dangers to labels for sure.
Yeah, and I think the point that you just made around having something in a medical record, it's like institutionally having that kind of a label or diagnosis can potentially be a very difficult thing. I think mental health, like we talk about it in almost like a binary, like we either are well or we're ill.
Yeah.
As opposed to something like when we're talking about mood disorders like anxiety and depression, that it's often more of being on a continuum.
Yeah, that's correct.
Yeah, and I think that's such an important thing. Also, I would love for people to understand that it's not someone experiences anxiety. That's not mean that you necessarily have an anxiety disorder.
Yeah.
Although there are folks that do suffer from that, but it doesn't necessarily mean you either suffer from anxiety disorder or you don't.
Yeah, that's correct. And you're right in terms of the continuum where I think all of us go through some days where what we experience is very close to depression, very close to anxiety, and it's just part of living. I don't think it's possible to just be happy every day. So yeah, I completely agree.
I guess so. Some of the questions that you do get from folks on Twitter is like those kinds of questions around, this is how I'm feeling. These are maybe the symptoms. Is this what this is? So those are sometimes the kind of questions that you get.
Yes. And after that, then it's how can I recover from it or what can I do?
Mm-hmm. And what do you find in terms of responding to the what can I do type question? So I'm curious about that, because do you think about it from that individual person? Do they provide context, or if they have provided context for what they're experiencing, and do you tailor your response based on that contact? Or do you find that it's, I don't know if you take more of a cognitive behavioral therapy approach?
It really depends. I don't have something specific that I do for everyone. It's really individualized because when I tailor my answers to the specific questions and to the socioeconomic, cultural background, I find that that's when it's the most helpful. So, for example, there are some people who reach out to me who can afford a therapist or a psychiatrist, and they just need that push to say, okay, yeah, perhaps you need to go and get those services, even if you have to pay for them. And they would usually go. And you have some others who cannot afford that or who are hesitant to go. And then that's when I have more hands-on work with them because I can send them some worksheets, I can discuss some of the causes and all that. So there is a lot of back and forth with those messages.
Wow. I mean, I think the work that you're doing there is just so important and valuable. And again, like, thank you so much for doing it.
Thank you.
Yeah. Do you find that the responses that you get and the questions that you get are from all over the world?
For the most part, it's Southeast Asia. So India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka. Then I have also North America where I am. I get some others from all over the world, but I would say that those are the main geographical locations where I get most of my questions from.
What's your sense of why that is?
Oh, well, I remember when I just started my Twitter account, my fiance is journalist and she has a lot of followers. So when she said that, oh, okay, Omar finally has his Twitter account, follow him. It started with being from that region. And I think it kind of stayed within that region for the most part, but it's starting to slowly expand.
Do you feel like there could be a critical mass that, like, I mean, you're one person.
Yeah, I haven't reached it yet, so I haven't really thought about it much. I'm going to try to do it as much as I can. And then after that, we'll see. Maybe it will take me longer to answer the questions, or maybe some of my colleagues can help me with it. I'm not really sure yet, but for now, I'm just enjoying doing that because I really love doing it.
Yeah, that's so great. I'm just curious to know what you've learned from connecting with people online as you have.
I can't really put it into words. It's so humbling. There are so many people who go through so many issues but show so much resilience. I feel like I've learned more from them that I could ever teach or I could ever help with, because it really opened my eyes to a lot of the struggles that people go through all over the world, and all their resilience and how they go through that and still able to continue life, continue working, continue providing for their families. It's so interesting.
I always think about the work that I engage in as such a privilege as well, and I also certainly don't work in the same capacity as you do, but I feel in so many ways that I have grown and learned so much from engaging in this work and having the privilege of working with clients as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And you have these people who barely know us and or don't know us at all and who open up about everything. And so it's such a privilege and so humbling to get to, hear all these stories and be able to help them. It's such a great feeling.
All the work that you've done in your day job, but also the support and the help that you provide online. I wonder what are some of the things, let's say 3 things that you would like for everyone to know or to think about when it comes to mental health.
Well, mental health is real. So let's start from the basic, because I feel that a lot of people still have that idea that mental health is not as important as physical health and is not worth treating, or it's something that we can just snap out of. So I would say that's really important. The second one is don't keep things inside. So if you go through anxiety, no matter what it is, no matter what stressor you have, don't keep it in. Talk about it. Express your anger, your sadness, because that's when it stays in, that's when it kind of festers and turns into a bigger issue. And the third thing would be to, whenever you can, just try to break stigma on mental health. If you see someone making fun, a family member, a friend, or anyone making fun of someone who has mental health, try to, call them out on it and let them know gently that, that's not okay, so that we can work on removing that stigma that exists on mental health.
It's really great. Just to your second point, and this is something that I often talk about, and hopefully I talk about it publicly as well. But, one of the things I think that is so important about taking care of ourselves from a mental and emotional perspective is to be talking about our experiences, what we're thinking, what we're feeling, and to have a community around us and support. But that I think it's really important to think about having trusted individuals, trusted people, because not everyone in our lives is maybe safe.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, especially when it's when it's about a struggle. I think it's one thing when it's like, oh, if I'm feeling this way in relation to this person, I would like to let you know that this is how I'm thinking and feeling. And so it's not necessarily to just not talk to people because in relation to like whatever it might be happening in relation to those people. But in terms of something where maybe it's a vulnerability, when there is a sense of vulnerability or something that feels really risky to share, I think that it's really important to think about having someone trusted or people in your life that you can trust to be able to talk about these things that are important and vulnerable.
Yeah, absolutely. And especially when we're struggling. And I feel that whether it's physical health or mental health, having a social circle, like people that we really can express that pain to, whether it's physical or mental, is so helpful. And I remember when I had gone through a surgery and I was alone, it was not easy at all, because I had so much time to just think about it and be with myself. Whereas when I had a surgery and I was with my family or friends, it was so much easier, because most of the time I was so busy talking or interacting with those trusted ones, loved ones, that I couldn't feel the pain as much.
Mm-hmm. And again, Omar, thank you so much for your time today, and also for, again, like the work that you do, the agency that you work for, but also what you do on Twitter. It's just really in awe, and I'm glad that I was able to find you and to have this opportunity to talk to you. So as we sort of wrap up, I do ask two questions of all the guests that I talk to. So firstly, is there a go-to book and or resource that you would recommend for people listening today?
For me, it's Mind Over Mood. And I use that book a lot. I also talked about it on Twitter a few times. So it's really an interesting book. It's, just to summarize, it's a cognitive behavioral therapy book that can be applied to ourselves. So if you're in an area or where there isn't a therapist or you cannot afford a therapist, that's a really good alternative. So that would be my go-to resource.
That's great. So that's Mind Over Mood.
Yes.
And so I call this podcast Life Stuff 101 because I'm constantly learning things all the time, of things where I think, oh gosh, if I knew this earlier in my life, like maybe things might have been a little bit easier. But, that's part of life, of course, is that we keep learning things. But when it comes to you, like, is there something that you wish that you maybe had learned earlier in life, or something that you wish that had been taught in school?
Yeah, I mean, mental health in general, I feel that there is not a big emphasis on prevention. And I feel that if we had been taught certain things in schools or learned how to manage our mental health, or even simple things like deep breathing and things like that very early on, that a lot of issues can be avoided later on. So I wish that that's taught in schools.
I love that, because it's the first, one of the three things that you had talked about, like that, that you wish that everybody would know about mental health, that mental health is a thing. If that was actually something that was taught to every child everywhere.
Yeah, exactly.
Imagine how much pain and suffering and difficulties and confusion that could be avoided potentially.
Yeah, and it also validates it. If we all know from the very beginning that mental health exists and really affects us, it also helps with the stigma that a lot of people go through and still go through every day.
Or that there might not be stigma if we were educated in that way. Yeah.
Exactly.
And just also the second point that I completely agree with is the breathing, the deep breathing. I think most of us don't actually realize that we think it's breathing, but we don't actually know, many of us, how to breathe as well as we could.
Yeah, absolutely.
And yeah, and it seems like a basic thing, but most of us aren't breathing as best as we could.
Yeah. And we start having those shallow breaths. Instead of breathing from our belly, we just do it from our chest, and we start hyperventilating. So yeah, breathing is actually very important.
Can you actually talk a little bit about that? Because it's actually something that hasn't come up yet, even though it's one of the topics that I love talking about all the time, is about how, I don't think I've talked about it on the podcast, but with clients and even with my personal life and so forth, I'm just kind of obsessed with about talking about the importance of breathing. You talked about shallow breath and hyperventilating and being able to breathe from the belly. Can you talk more about the importance of those things?
Yeah, so when we breathe from our chest, so basically when I say from our chest, it means that it's the chest that's moving when we breathe. Those are very shallow breaths, and they tend to lead to an increased heart rate, which can lead to an increased sense of anxiety or anxiety symptoms. So, and a lot of us do it when we're stressed out, when we're doing homework or doing our work and we're really stressed out, we tend to revert to those shallow breaths, and they increase our anxiety. Belly breathing is when our belly moves when we breathe, and those are really those deep breaths that calm us down, that bring our heart rate down, and so those are really the important ones. And so even myself, whenever I catch myself having those shallow breaths, I just put a hand on my belly and make sure that all my breaths go from my belly itself.
And there are actually apps. There's an app for that to learn how to guide. There's, guided meditation, but there's also guided breathing apps. And there's a lot of breathing techniques also that could be practiced as well to be able to access those deeper breaths. Because some people, even with that practice of putting the hand on the belly, they still often don't, especially if the shallow breath is so habitual, that it's difficult for people to really even know that they need to be breathing even more deeply than they are.
No, I completely agree with you.
It's actually really a fascinating thing. And like you were saying, if that was something that was taught earlier in life, it was part of a school curriculum or something like that, that it would just really be a way that we would all understand ways that we can regulate much, much better.
Yeah, for sure. And I wish I knew that too, because I went through a long time of having certain anxiety symptoms where deep breathing really centers me. Even today, when I'm at work and I go through really stressful days or even stressful sessions, in between sessions, I'll just go and have some deep breaths and center myself, and then I'm ready to continue facing my day.
Yes, and I do exactly or very similar kind of a practice as well. So thank you very much again for mentioning that, because I'm hoping that we can maybe create more of a conversation about that as well. So, wow, that was so great. I'm really grateful for your time today, Omar.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, I was, and as we close things off, for people listening, where can people find you? Because we've been talking about Twitter, but we haven't actually talked about how they can find you on Twitter.
Oh, so my handle is at Bazza Power, so Bazza Power, because I used to play as a power forward when I played soccer. And Bazza is my last name, so you can find me there on Twitter. And please don't hesitate to send any questions that you may have, DMs. I'm always open.
Thank you so much. And just, I guess one more question, and this is totally outside of anything, but I know that you have a fur family.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and you mentioned, I think, 2 dogs and 3 cats?
Yes, correct.
Can you tell me their names?
There is Kirby, Liana. Those are 2 kittens that I adopted from the Oshawa Animal Services a few months ago. They're actually sleeping on me right now as we speak.
Oh.
There is Tara that I adopted last year. I have Mocha, my Labrador, who's been with me for 3 years now, and Pixel, a German Shepherd that I got last year.
And our fur babies are also really great for mental health as well. So,
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
They're always with me when I'm home, and they bring so much happiness to my life. So they're really important to me.
Oh, that's great. Thank you again, Omar.
Thank you so much.
I really loved the conversation I had with Omar, learning about the work he does with the East Metro Youth Services, as well as his passion for providing support and education around mental health on Twitter. Once again, Omar can be found on Twitter at BAZZAPOWER or at BAZZAPOWER. That's at Bazza Power. And in addition to the valuable mental health content he shares, every so often he also shares pics of his super adorable cats and dogs as well. If you're happening to listen to this in advance of Bell Let's Talk Day, which is in the year 2020, is on January 29th, please check out their initiative and consider taking action on how you can be a part of the mental health conversation as well. And while Bell Let's Talk is a larger initiative and one way to start and have the conversation around mental health, there are also, of course, folks, individuals like Omar, who is talking about and taking action more days than not. Thank you so much for joining me today. If you're new here, like what you heard, please consider subscribing wherever you like to listen to your podcasts or wherever you might be listening to this episode right now. And if you've been on this ride with me for a number of episodes now, I'm so very grateful for your time and attention. And with that, I hope you have a lovely rest of the day or evening wherever you are in the world, and I'll be talking again to you real soon.
Thank you for listening to today's episode of Life Stuff 101. If you haven't already, please subscribe so that you'll be among the first to be notified when new episodes are released. Always be sure to check out lifestuff101.com for show notes and to be a member of Mio's Miracle Mob. Because as the wise modern-day philosopher John Bon Jovi once said, miracles happen every day. Change your perception of what a miracle is, and you'll see them all around you.